Friday the 13th was first released in the year 1980 at the tail end of a movement in American cinema known as the New Hollywood movement. This was a time where the studio controls and production codes of American films became a lot more relaxed. During this period, a lot of new filmmakers emerged, producing films that were independent from studios and actually garnered a lot of success. These were films that, released a decade ago, would probably be forsaken by the MPAA and the Legion of Decency, which was an organization that was made to censor films. But thanks to the release of these films and their success, and the figure of Jack Valenti joining the MPAA, production codes became a lot more relaxed. So what does this have to do with Friday the 13th? Well, if you think about it, Friday the 13th has a lot of themes about it that are very sexual and violent in nature, very much so. So in a way, you kind of have New Hollywood and Jack Valenti to thank for the release of the Friday the 13th series and the way it was. In many ways, Friday the 13th was supposed to follow in Halloween's success, and it was very much inspired by it. With a group of young actors and a director hungry to make a name for himself, Friday the 13th was supposed to be a roller coaster ride of scares that make you jump out of your seat, while at the same time in other scenes actually giving you a bit of a laugh. If you've never seen the original film, you'd be surprised to know Jason Voorhees is not even the killer in it. That's because Jason was just supposed to be a normal everyday kid that drowns in the lake and is this, spooky tale of legend to create suspense in the film. It was only after a few rewrites where they were trying to make the story more unique that Jason became the deformed child that we see at the end of the first movie. Instead of Jason, who is mainly just contributing to the lore of the universe in the first film, the main antagonist role is filled by his mother, Pamela. Pamela's motivation to kill stems mainly from the fact that her son drowned in Crystal Lake a few years beforehand, which was the reason for the camp originally shutting down, and she's out to extract her revenge on the counselors. After the commercial success of the first film, Paramount Pictures decided to pick up the rights of the Friday the 13th brand. Since Pamela Voorhees was killed off in the first one, Paramount needed a new villain for the next set of these movies. So obviously they turned to the deformed child in the lake, her son, Jason Voorhees. For the rest of the decade, Paramount Pictures would churn out Friday the 13th movies like they're a well-oiled machine. There would be around 10 movies in total, all the way up until I think 2001. To better understand how these movies place in history, I'm going to do a little bit of a timeline here so you get an idea. In 1980, the original Friday the 13th dropped, which featured Pamela Voorhees, mother of the deceased Jason Voorhees, coming back to the renovation of Crystal Lake and murdering all the new counselors as punishment for the old counselors neglecting her son in the lake years ago, leading to his drowning. However, the last surviving counselor, Alice Hardy, manages to fight back against Pamela, picks up a machete and chops off her head, escaping to the lake. Once the cops get there, she's pulled under the lake by this horrid, deformed creature of a child, but she's rescued just in time when the cops get there. However, none of the cops seem to see the kid. The next year, in 1981, shows the release of Friday the 13th Part 2, which takes place right after the events of the first part. After killing Alice Hardy, Jason Voorhees makes his way back to Crystal Lake. The film takes place at another camp right around the area where the original Crystal Lake was located, which is called Camp Blood by the counselors. As these counselors prepare to get ready for the kids arriving, they are invaded by Jason, who picks them off one by one. This film features a whole new cast of counselors, the new character of Jason, other than the recurring character Alice Hardy at the beginning, there's no familiar faces here. It's in this first sequel that we start to see a pattern develop here in these films. This plot pattern is as iconic as Jason himself and features themes such as underage drinking, teenage sex, female nudity, and lots of cock blocking from Jason himself. Seriously, this guy hates sex. If you need a visual aid of what these patterns look like, well, here you go.
stayed in the kitchen where she won't lose. A woman shouldn't even be allowed in these gears.
And of course, at the end of the film, we have one survivor who manages to convince Jason that she is his mother by putting on her old sweater, which plays a mind trick with him long enough so that she can slice him in the neck with a machete and escape. A little fun fact about this movie is Jason did not yet have his hockey mask in it. He instead wears a bag on his head with one eye hole. It's not till the next movie that he finds the hockey mask off of a victim. The very next year, in 1982, we see Friday the 13th Part 3, which is almost an exact carbon copy of Part 2. Again, we have a bunch of camp counselors drinking, fucking, and getting sliced to bits by Jason himself. And of course, only one manages to survive the night and seems to kill Jason for good. Are you seeing the pattern here? 3 films, 3 survivors in total. 2 years later, in 1984, we get the release of Friday the 13th Part 4, the final chapter. Now, of course, this would be nowhere near the final chapter. It takes place right after Part 3 with law enforcement coming to clean up Jason's mess he leaves in a barn near the camp he attacked most recently. They take his body to the morgue, however, it turns out Jason isn't dead, and he kills 2 doctors there and escapes the morgue. A group of teens go to Camp Crystal Lake to the woods for some summer fun, which features skinny dipping, getting drunk, and having tons of sex. And as history shows, where there's sex, there's Jason to ruin the fun. However, this time, things are a tad different. We get our first recurring character introduced, Tommy Jarvis, played by Corey Feldman, who, as you know, plays Mouth in The Goonies. The Jarvis family lives right around Crystal Lake and comes in contact with Jason when they discover a massacre he leaves to the teens who moved in next door. Jason then comes after Tommy and his sister. However, Tommy, like in the second film, is able to outsmart Jason and hack him to death with a machete. Yes, a 12-year-old kid ends up being the one to kill Jason. Really? Friday the 13th, A New Beginning, pulls us a bit into the future where Tommy Jarvis is now a teen and is going through a lot of mental troubles due to his encounter with Jason. He's taken to a rehab center where, after another patient is murdered, Tommy finds himself in a series of other murders that fit Jason's MO. Tommy's worst fears come to life when Jason infiltrates the rehab center, hacking patients to death and hunting him. Tommy and 2 other people at the center manage to crawl to the attic of a barn and are able to push Jason onto a bed of spikes, which kills him again this time. However, upon killing him, they realize the killer wasn't Jason at all. It was simply the father of the patient that was killed earlier in the film at the rehab center, extracting revenge on the people there for letting his son die. The film also has the themes of the prior 4, however, I would say that the sex in it is toned down quite a bit. It's after this first installment that we start to see the franchise take a turn in another direction, becoming more and more ridiculous after every movie that follows. Like seriously, the rest 5 films prove that Jason cannot be killed in any sense of the imagination and is not even a mortal being. Part 6, Jason Lives, showcases Tommy Jarvis after he has escaped from the hospital after killing the impersonator of Jason. Tommy decides he's going to go and burn Jason's corpse, making it 100% certain that he can never come back. However, upon seeing Jason's body again in his coffin, Tommy goes berserk, shoving a metal pole in his chest. After shoving the metal pole in his chest, bolts of lightning come down from the sky and strike the pole, sending an electrical shock through Jason's body and bringing him back to life. Yes, you've heard it here first, folks. Apparently, after being dead for months on end, you can be brought back to life even though you've been eaten away by maggots and your organs haven't worked in forever. Thus was born Zombie Jason, who makes it to the end of the film and surprisingly is killed off again at the end of the film. You would think that they'd keep him around a bit longer this time. Tommy is able to sink Jason to the bottom of Crystal Lake, but my god, is the process to get him there ridiculous. In order to die again, Jason has to be shot several times, stabbed, set on fire, have a chain with a boulder attached to it thrown into the lake, drowning him, and then have a motor blade cut his neck. If you thought Part 6 was stupid, wait till you hear about Part 7. A New Blood. You're probably thinking, there's no way Jason could come back this time. Impossible. You're wrong. In this film, he gets revived by telekinesis. Telekinesis. protagonist of this film is a girl who discovers she has telekinetic powers after drowning her father in Crystal Lake when she was little. When returning to Crystal Lake for therapy, she tries to revive her father in the lake, but instead accidentally revives Jason. The rest of the film follows as you'd expect. There's a bunch of horny teens in the cabin next to hers, so she gets invited to their parties, but then Jason crashes the parties and starts slaughtering people who are trying to get drunk and have sex. In this movie, Jason survives stab wounds, being attacked by telekinetic powers, electrocution, hanging, and being drowned, but eventually he is killed again after he has an entire house dropped on him, I think it is, or at least part of a dock dropped onto him while he's being drowned, and I think he's being choked out while he's being drowned. And that finally kills him. Again, this film is probably the most ridiculous that I've seen out of the franchise. I can't comment on parts 9 and 10 because I just read the summaries of those and couldn't bring myself to watch them. Part 8 is the last film I'm going to talk about in depth, which is called Jason Takes Manhattan, which, by the way, takes place for about 20 minutes in Manhattan. The rest of the movie is on a boat. It features Jason walking around Manhattan with nobody questioning what this guy, who's covered in like disgusting sewage and a hockey mask, with a blade in his hand, is doing. I need not say more. The next two parts, part 9 and 10, come out a little bit later, especially part 10, so I'm not really going to talk too much about them. They can be summarized simply by their description of how ridiculous they are. So after that long-winded historical breakdown of the Friday the 13th series, let's take a look at the killer himself, Jason Voorhees. Jason is a deformed, hulking mass of a human being who is almost always seen wearing some kind of mask over his face, almost ashamed to have it displayed. Through most of the films, he wears an iconic hockey mask to conceal his face. Jason tends to stalk and live around the area of Crystal Lake, which is his prime hunting grounds. His victims usually consist of teenagers, however, he's not afraid to kill adults that stand in his way. Jason has died several times and continues to prove that he's not a mortal being by any sense of the definition. If I were to count on my fingers every time he died, I'd have to get a third hand because I wouldn't have enough fingers. He has survived stab wounds, gunshots, being set on fire, being electrocuted, being impaled, telekinetic powers, being hanged, drowning, being shoved into toxic waste. Need I say more?
But when you kill someone by chopping off their head, rolling them up in a carpet and burning it, you better make sure they're dead.
Jason is typically seen wielding a machete or axe of some kind. However, he's not at all afraid to use any means whatsoever to kill somebody. To kill his victims, Jason has squeezed their head in his hands, choked them to death, punched their heads off, threw them through windows. He'll use any type of brute force to kill you. Jason's methods of killing are brutal and remorseless. He will do anything possible to kill someone who stands in his path. He doesn't kill for any perceived meaning, it's just in his nature. The protagonists of the Friday the 13th films are usually teenage females, except for Tommy Jarvis. These teens are usually camp counselors, students, or even just people living in the woods around Crystal Lake. These protagonists are usually surrounded by a group of friends, most of whom are getting drunk a lot and hooking up with each other. Far from the help of police or adults, these characters have to find the strength within themselves to defeat Jason, either by physical force or by outsmarting him. Lots of times these protagonists are held back by some overwhelming phobia that stems from a past life experience, whether that be being drowned or even a past encounter with Jason himself. Due to the fact that these films were pretty low budget, the first few of them were able to do very well commercially. However, this doesn't mean that they sat well with critics. The best that any of these movies did was probably the first one, which got kind of like 50-50 reception. Some people liked it, some people didn't. It came off as kind of cheesy, a bit ridiculous. There wasn't a high amount of quality to these movies, and for people expecting another Halloween, they were going to be disappointed. And I honestly can't blame critics too much. These movies, they're not that financially sound. Despite not being the most well-received series by critics, Friday the 13th is one of the biggest horror franchises of all time, maybe joined by Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street. Jason Voorhees stands as one of the biggest horror icons today, featured in merchandise, posters, and even on costumes that kids wear on Halloween every year on October 31st. Along with being portrayed in films, Jason has also had a few video games made about him, most recently being the Friday the 13th video game released a couple years ago. 2009 saw a remake being made of Friday the 13th, however time will tell if another one is ever made. Thank you for watching this first episode of Horrors of Halloween, Friday the 13th version. I really hope you liked it. I have a couple more I'm planning to release. I'm guessing I'm going to have around between 2 to 4, depending on how well I can get these done. The next one is going to be the series that inspired Friday the 13th, Halloween. Tune in next time for another episode of Nonsensical Cinemas. Bye!